Well, that was something.
Yeah, I was right before this. We had this whole other setup going, and Joey calls me and he's like, "I don't know what happened. My computer just had an instant death, so we're gonna try this again."
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're here. We did it. We are recording. And we've got another in our series of episodes on Operation Market Garden. And this one is kind of a bit of the precursor to all of it. So this is actually the first recording that our listeners and guests are going to get. This is it. This is kind of kickoff episode for our Market Garden 80 kind of week. So we're going to talk airborne operations. We're going to talk about the armor. We're going to talk about how it's been remembered. We're going to talk about the movies that have been made. We're going to talk about some of the men who fought in it. We're going to talk about some of this, some of that, a little bit here, a little bit there. But Bo, I think now that we've done what, 4
Yeah,
episodes, kind of feeling good about it, right? Like
yeah.
this is a pretty good series.
And it's also unique that the because each person brings in something unique, that they're particularly interested in, but they also share a lot of commonalities, which has been great. Like we didn't tell them to do any of this. Like they're bringing all of this to us.
Yeah, yeah. So today, or for this episode, um, today, tomorrow, next year, depending on whenever you're going to listen to it. Who knows? Who cares? Anyways, we've got, and I should have asked. I don't want to say his name wrong, but I'm going to take a shot in the dark, and I'm going to look down and see if he's nodding yes or no in the bottom. James Daly. There we go. James Daly, who is the author of Proposed Airborne Assaults in the Liberation of Europe. It's a new book out now through Frontline Books. But let's get James on the stage. There he is. James, I regret not having asked your last name pronunciation before we got started. But welcome to Homebrew.
Good evening, or evening here. I guess it's afternoon with you guys.
No, it's still, well, yeah, it is afternoon now. Yeah, look at that by a whole 38 minutes. Well, welcome to Homebrew History.
Thank you for having me.
And let's talk a little bit about how you get interested in writing about the operations that never happened, right? Because it's a lot like writing the biography of the president who lost the election, or of the man who wanted to be prime minister but wasn't. So how do you get interested in writing about this aspect of one of the largest kind of offensives and operations of the war? How do you get into writing about the things that didn't happen?
So I guess the long story put short is my granddad was an Arnhem veteran. He died when I was 11. Talked about it very, very, very little, like very little. So we didn't really know much. But obviously when you're 11, hearing about your granddad taking part in something so epic, and oh, by the way, there's a film about what happened to granddad. That's magic, really, isn't it? When you're a young boy. So discovering all this stuff. I studied history at university. I've worked in museums. I always wanted to do something about Arnhem, but to be honest, it's been so well written about. Trying to find a new angle, or trying to find something that would actually add to it, because I didn't want to just do another general book that was pretty similar to all the other general books. It might have sold copies, but I kind of wanted to add something to it. And I was watching the film Bridge Too Far, and there's a scene where Boy Browning refers to, there's been X number of cancelled operations, and this time the party's on. And it hit me like a light bulb, like a lightning bolt, in terms of these operations had such a big impact on what happened, but we know so little about them. In most books, they were relegated to a paragraph or two at most. But what you've got is potentially a thread that runs between D-Day and Arnhem that could make sense of something quite important, but also was potentially a new angle. And I was quite lucky that there was a huge amount of files at the National Archives in London to work through. So it's been pretty much 10 years of working through files and researching it, and here we are.
So what have you found that's sort of piqued your interest to dig deeper?
Yeah, so I assumed a lot of the history assumes that for all of these operations, the Airborne went to the airfield, got in the planes, and oh, by the way, it's cancelled. That only happened for 3 or 4 of the operations out of them all. So these operations aren't equal. They all have a different impact. Some of them are pretty much a discussion between several headquarters. A couple of memos go back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't have a huge impact on the private soldier at all. Several of them are to the point where they are at the airfield. So it's quite nuanced. It's not just a case of look at all these operations, they're huge, they had a big impact. They all had a different impact in their own way.
Mm-hmm.
But you can see very clearly there's a thread that runs from D-Day to Arnhem, and the things that people often categorize as being Arnhem failures, you can see them starting to creep in early campaign, and some of those factors that affect the planning and the leadership for Market Garden, you can see them emerging earlier as well.
Because the whole desire behind all of these operations is to get the airborne units in the field, that you've spent time, you've spent money, you've worked hard to get these men trained and ready to jump. And they jump in Italy with the 82nd Airborne, and they jump in Italy and in Sicily with the 6th Airborne. And then you get the Normandy jumps where you get 6th, 82nd, and 101st involved. But now all of a sudden you've got this elite trained fighting force, highly motivated go-getter soldiers, and they're sitting in England while a lot of the hard yards of fighting is being done now that they've left the front, being done by regular infantry, and you want to put them in the field. So what's the first kind of push for this rather?
So 1st Airborne Division feature strongly in this. Other divisions and brigades pop in and out as the case may be, but 1st Airborne Division are run through this like the spine, so to speak, and they're held back on D-Day for either for emergency operations or for exploitation. So 6th Airborne Division, for example, and 82nd and 101st, they know what they're going to be doing on D-Day. It's very defined. It's what you'd call a set-piece battle. They're able to rehearse very, very carefully, very methodically, which bears out in the success or even where they're able to adapt. With 1st Airborne Division, they simply don't have that. So they know they're going to be doing something, but what, where, and when, these are all question marks. So even from D-Day onwards, there's a vagueness about it. They're not able to prepare for any of these things. Going further back, I think the imperative, as well as all the things you mentioned, the thing about airborne forces, both for Britain and America, is that it's still a relatively new concept. So they're still developing the theory and the doctrine pretty much on the job. So everyone, either on the chiefs of staff or in all of the headquarters, has got their own ideas about airborne forces. They're all pretty different. There isn't a huge common understanding. So Marshall and Arnold in Washington are pressing for very ambitious operations, very dynamic, but at a big distance, which isn't always possible with the logistics. So Eisenhower's under pressure from that. Obviously, Montgomery's got his own ideas and always got extreme confidence in his ideas. So it's a very complex scenario that the airborne forces find themselves in June 1944.
So, James, because we've kind of talked about a lot of varying things, as our listeners will find out as these episodes kind of come out, but there's also been sort of a common theme with some of the people that we've interviewed, that working, with varying Allied armies is rather difficult. So I imagine that the prior planning that goes into a lot of these canceled operations is something similar. But what does that do to sort of the psyche of the men? Those individuals who make it to the airfields, they're ready to take off. They're, for a lack of better terms, they're foaming at the mouth. They're ready to, take flight and take action. and it gets
Yeah.
canceled. And how does that affect them in their preparedness for the inevitability of Market Garden?
So, I mean, the private soldier, for example, only three wouldn't even have known about some of these operations.
Mm-hmm.
There were probably 3 or 4 that they were briefed for and started to emplane or were at the airfield. But we do know that the cancellation of those hit them very hard, to the point where divisional commanders or even Boy Browning had to send messages trying to hold up their morale, saying like, sorry, this one's been cancelled, but we can promise that when you do go, it will be decisive. So that they are having to put in effort to try and shore up morale. I think the biggest impact of these operations and the planning is probably on staff, planners, and divisional commanders, that sort of level, because pretty much every operation, so the Allied Airborne Army or Airborne Corps or the Airborne Division staffs are having to plan. So 14, 15 times they develop a plan and they have to junk it. Now that, psychologically, working on a plan after you've already done, say, 10 or 12 and thinking, is this one actually going to happen? That you'd have to be superhuman for that not to have some sort of effect in terms of, if you're working on something that you think there's a fair chance it's just going to get scrapped and you're told to work on something else, of course that's going to have an impact. And there are some references to the staff officers being almost at the point of exhaustion because they're working. In some cases, these are tri-service operations, because you've got to line up the Air Force with the Airborne, you've got to line it up with the ground forces. Some of these operations involve a naval element in Brittany and in Normandy. They've got to, a lot of them are in Britain. They've then got to fly to France quite regularly. So it's a punishing schedule in terms of putting all of this stuff together. So by early September, they've been burning the candle at both ends, so to speak. So of course it's had a big impact on them.
So what are a couple of the operations that just never get off of the ground, never leave the paper, never leave the type print?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple in Normandy, Wastage and Tuxedo. They're put together as emergency operations in case the build-up is slowed down. They don't happen. Operation Wild Oats in Normandy, that's really controversial. That would have essentially.
I think that's the best name of all of them. Wild Oats.
Some of these code names are just absolutely wonderful. I don't think there's any rhyme or reason to them, but
so the Wastage and Wild Oats want to effectively continue the airborne drops of Normandy, but now that they've pushed inland, now that they're moving along, because it's an idea to try and force the spearhead, try and force the offensive.
Yeah, Wild Oats is essentially an airborne extension of Villers-Bocage. So it would have been landing at Eversey, which is about 10 miles between Villers-Bocage and Caen. So the idea is it outflanks Caen, rolls up the German front line before it solidifies. There's a huge row over that because the air forces don't want to do it. Lee Mallory's really not keen. That's when Montgomery calls Lee Mallory a gutless bugger, and all of these things. So you can see even early on, there's not a common understanding of how it's going to be done. So they're having to make this up as they go along. That's the last operation for Normandy. In Brittany, there's several operations planned. The idea with those being, if you can capture deep water ports in Brittany, you can bring men and material straight from America. So there's Beneficiary at St. Malo, Sword Hilt at Brest, and Hands Up at Quiberon Bay. Those don't happen because there's that window of we can liberate Brittany over land just as easily.
And that's what's happening, is the Allied advance is just simply outrunning.
Yeah, and the issue there is that to plan an airborne operation, you do need 5 to 7 days to line everything up. So from the moment it's conceived to the moment it lands, a lot can change. And so, for example, we get to Transfigure, which would be a landing between Paris and Orléans to cut off German retreat. That the drop zones just get overrun because the Allied advance is just so fast. The same thing happens with Operation Linnet at the end of August. That would have been around Tournai and Lille, which is very much World War I battlefield area. That would have been a similar thing to cut off the German retreat and to try and form a pocket. The drop zones just get overrun, so it'd be pointless. And this constantly keeps adding to the problem of where are we going to do it?
Jake, what was sort of the most bizarre thing you've come across in your research, sort of the lead up to Operation Market Garden?
I mean, the one that I find the most bizarre is Operation Beneficiary at St. Malo. There's a plan to land gliders on a beach at low tide, which doesn't seem like the most confidence-inspiring thing to me. You hope partly because sand isn't, sand could be soft, and also you hope someone's checked the tide times, don't you? You hope the tide's not come in. That's bizarre. And the Normandy operations, there's a point where they say one of the operation orders is we don't know where you'll be dropped, and we don't know who will be on the ground to meet you, and you might not get maps until you land as well. So that's pretty grim, really.
That's exactly how I want to go in. That's perfect.
Yeah.
Zero preparation, no understanding of what's there.
Yeah,
this is good.
Yeah, it's I don't know how anyone thought that would be a good idea.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if the enemy has no idea what I'm doing, then neither do I. So we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
So as the plans start to come together, let's talk about the two where I think you can see the most of the planning for Market Garden. You can see its origins in Linnet and in Comet, right? Because you can kind of make it out in Linnet. You can really see it in Comet. So walk us through what is Operation Linnet, because there's Linnet 1 and Linnet 2, right?
Yeah. So Linnet 1 is conceived in late August, and the idea there is to land basically the same force that would take part in Market Garden, 1st Airborne Division with the Poles, 82nd and 101st, to land them to the east of Lille on the French-Belgian border, so around Courtrai, Tournai, and places like that. What you've got there, and particularly in Belgium and Holland, you've got lots of river crossings and canals. They're all crossroad towns as well. So the idea is that if you control the river crossings and you control these crossroad towns, you can cut off the German retreat, because the Germans are in full retreat in late August, to the point where it's difficult to pin down exactly who's where. And at this point, when the plan starts, the Allies have just liberated Paris. They're sort of somewhere between Paris and the Belgian border. So at the point it's conceived, it seems like an ambitious idea, but the advance after Paris is so rapid, and the British advance is referred to as the Great Swan, because they reach Brussels by early September, which completely messes up the schedule for Linnet. But several of the things with Linnet, you do see Market Garden-esque errors starting to creep in. So the British 1st Airborne would have landed about 10 miles from their objective, which was a bridge. It starts to feel a bit familiar. There's things like that starting to creep in. So Linnet 1 is cancelled, and then Linnet 2 comes along, where things really start to get messy. So Brereton, who's the commander of 1st Allied Airborne Army, obviously cancels Linnet 1 and says, no bother, we'll just move it to the other side of Belgium and land them at Liège instead, to which his deputy Browning threatens to resign, because he says we can't do it at 3 days' notice because we won't have any maps. And the mistake Browning makes is he doesn't just threaten to resign. He says that, by the way, my divisional commanders will threaten to resign too, including Taylor and Gavin, who of course wouldn't have resigned. So Browning rescinds his resignation, but a resignation is almost like a one-shot card, isn't it? You can't threaten to resign more than once, because it's like crying wolf. So you've got two people, Brereton and Browning, who have got very little in common, don't get on, and have clearly fractured that relationship, but are still both in post by the time we get to Comet and then Market Garden. So things are getting very, very fragile, I'd say.
And waiting in the wings, you've still got Matthew Ridgway trying to figure out where he fits in all of this.
Yeah, because earlier in the 1944 campaign, Browning was the only corps level commander available. By late August, Ridgway's available, who of course is much more experienced. And by August, Airborne is very much an American-led thing. So Browning's star is falling in one respect, and he knows it. So you've got lots of personality issues going on here.
And Ridgway can show the kind of the successful Italy, Sicily. He can show North Africa. He can show Normandy. Whereas Browning's got, well, we've been training and we're really keyed up and we're very excited about this, and we just love the opportunity to get involved and throw in a hand and help out. So what happens after both linnets are out and we start moving in towards Comet?
Yeah, so Comet is conceived about when Linnet is cancelled. So one of the things I always think with Comet is that people assume that Market Garden suddenly occurs on the 10th of September when the planning starts. Actually, Market Garden is a modification of an existing plan. So really, Market Garden starts about the 3rd of September. So that's when they identify that they need to capture these river crossings over the Maas, the Waal, and the Rhine. Comet is essentially Market Garden, but scaled down. So the idea is that it would be the 1st British Airborne Division and the Polish Brigade. So the 4th Parachute Brigade would capture the bridge at Graf, the Air Landing Brigade, the bridge at Nijmegen, and 1st Parachute Brigade, the bridge at Arnhem, with the Poles in reserve. And one of the things that's interesting about Comet is that Browning's corps headquarters would have landed, even though it's a division level operation. So his HQ would have been completely pointless, really. It's hard to see what he would have done other than got in the way. One of the things about Comet is that people often use Arnhem to look at a Market Garden, to look at Comet and go, well, if Market Garden was a disaster, Comet would have been even more of a disaster. I think the important thing there is that things are changing very, very rapidly in early September. So the situation in Holland in, say, the 8th, 9th or 10th of September are very different to the situation on the 17th. It's difficult to know for certain because the German situation is so chaotic and it's so hard to pin down who's where and what their effectiveness would have been. But it's not comparing like for like because it's a very different situation. So
we were talking with was that Paul we were just talking with? We were discussing, one of the great schools right now is what if it would have happened a week or 9 or 10 days earlier? You catch the Germans 9-10 days earlier before they're able to solidify a defense, before they're able to recall certain units, before troops are ready to actually fight. You're talking about dropping in a kind of coup de main style British paratroopers behind enemy lines and then still having an armored column pursue up through that kind of narrow corridor towards Arnhem. I mean, we're not going to do the what ifs, but you almost wonder, is it worth the punt on the 9th and on the 8th and 9th than it would have been on the 17th?
Things are certainly more fluid around then, aren't they? Because it's about the 9th that Dempsey and Horrocks start to realise that the front line has started to solidify. So presumably a couple of days before that, it's not solidifying. So there might have been a window of opportunity. I mean, I don't think we can really know for certain unless someone wants to do a real deep dive on the state of the German defences in that part of Holland on those days. But I do think there is a window of opportunity, possibly. I mean, the other thing you mentioned about coup de main is that landing a brigade at each bridge would have made a lot more sense in ways, because for Market Garden, the British Airborne Division landed at Arnhem. They landed 2 brigades on the first day. Only one brigade could actually head off to the bridge because the other brigade had to hold the drop zones. Right. If you're landing a brigade at each bridge, they can just pack up and go straight away because they're not holding it for a subsequent lift. So it is more coup de main. Because you're landing a smaller force, for example, at Arnhem, the furthest drop zones away that were used for Market Garden at Ginkle Heath wouldn't have been used. So the brigade would have been landing 6 miles away rather than 8. So there are some margins there. And the other thing that is quite clear with Comet is when I looked at the maps, there's also a tiny drop zone identified near each of the bridges that would have been for a glider coup de man that would have landed at first light, very similar to Pegasus Bridge. Now, why that was considered okay for Comet but wasn't considered okay for Market Garden a week later, I haven't seen anything in the planning that adequately sort of summarizes why that was changed. I can't think.
Is that something that you think is changed by Airborne, or that's something that comes kind of exterior, maybe from like Transport Command?
It's possibly from the air side of things, because particularly the British airborne planning, the Air Force had a veto really over drop zones. And also there were concerns about flak near the bridges. We know that affected the selection of drop zones. So it's not too much of a jump to think that could have affected deleting that aspect of the plan. But again, you wonder whether a company of troops landing on top of the ramp, basically right next to the ramp of the bridges, might not have made a real difference. Because we know that the land south of Arnhem Bridge, for example, probably wasn't suitable for a large landing, but for a company of gliders, you're talking about a handful of gliders, that's probably doable.
So the more that we talk about, sort of the lead up to Market Garden and the Market Garden itself, I think I've come to the realization that Market Garden can be summed up with 2 P words: planning and personalities. When it comes to Operation Market Garden and things leading up to that, how true is that?
Yeah, I think so. I think personalities are a big part of it. And my research, it was interesting that one personality I thought that would come through in a lot actually didn't. So Montgomery is actually quite absent in a lot of this planning, but partly because he didn't commit things to paper, he talked to people. But you've got such a complex picture because you've got allied warfare, so you've got different national perspectives, you've got different manpower perspectives. Browning and Brereton, for example, you couldn't imagine 2 people more different. Browning's a guardsman. He's he's very used to working in the War Office and pulling strings, and he's a very, very effective administrator, hugely effective. Not a battle commander. I don't think that's unfair to say. Clearly not an easy person to get on with. It's an extremely complex picture. So trying to navigate plans through these personalities would have been extremely difficult, I think. And it's not difficult to see how that leads to compromises. It leads to things being deleted. It leads to arguments. It's not a good basis for laying on a joint operation, is it really?
And the want had always kind of been by Montgomery to push and try and come up with this narrow front, which goes against what the American aspect of the offensive in Northwest Europe looks like, which is the broad front approach, and having your 3 and 4 army groups attacking simultaneously across a massive line. And then, of course, there's that great meeting between Ike and Monty, and we watch essentially as Ike almost just sort of throws his hands up and lets Montgomery run with it. And that's really the end of the Comets and the Linnets, and all of that's in the past. How do we coalesce around, the ideas for Market Garden? Because I know that your book kind of runs us up through the preview, but we know that you're doing a wonderful kind of on this day series of tweets on social media. You've done a lot of work on this aspect of it, which now we're past the 9th. We're almost past the 10th. What do we do on September the 10th between then and September the 17th for D-Day for Market Garden? And how does it all kind of congeal?
Yeah, and I think this point actually sums up completely how these aren't contained operations, they run through. So on the morning of the 10th is when Dempsey cancels Comet, but then meets with Montgomery to get permission to do Comet scaled up. So these meetings almost run consecutively. So they're it's not completely leaving the plan. It's just adapting it for something else to different conditions. And then that planning carries on, and they reuse the planning. So First Parachute Brigade, their job for Market Garden is exactly the same as it is for Comet. So they haven't had 7 days to plan for it. They've had 14, which isn't always understood. And the plan's exactly the same. It doesn't change for them. So it's more complex. And I think partly the issue is, the film Market Garden, of course, they couldn't summarize Comet and they couldn't summarize it in it. But sometimes that does give the impression that Browning sat the divisional commanders in a room and told them this is what we're going to do, and they were completely shocked. That sometimes I think that can give the impression that that's what actually happened, but it was probably it's more like a treadmill, really constantly turning.
With the 82nd and the 101st though being excluded from the Comet operations, is there maybe an element of surprise? Because we know that Gavin, of course, gives that great quote to Jack Norton. He says, "My God, he can't be serious." When Browning and Urquhart are talking about the plan for Market Garden, is there some shock for the American aspect of it?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, I think, and again, this comes back to one, the personality side of things, and two, the inter-allied aspect with different ways of doing things. Where because Market Garden is very much a British operation, and somehow Browning is put in command of it. Taylor and Gavin aren't in on that strategic side of the planning in a way that they might be if the operation was happening in Bradley's area. So they're coming in at it quite late. The broad plan's been put together, whereas you can't help but think that, I mean, I think there are examples, aren't there, where Taylor actually demands changes to 101st's plan
and gets them
because he's able to do that, because he's experienced and he's got top cover from his seniors, whereas Urquhart, who I think is always I always feel quite sorry for Urquhart, because he's clearly very capable, very, very able, but it's completely the modern parlance we would say is micromanaged by Browning. He's cut out of a lot of meetings and really doesn't have much choice. He's just given a plan and told to get on with it.
So, James, what does it take to go from Comet to Market Garden? And because, you've basically explained that Operation Comet was simply a downscale of the actual Market Garden campaign. So what does it take to make Market Garden happen compared to Comet?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, there's different plans putting together. So, 1st Airborne Division, having already planned Comet, is pretty much an adaptation. Because 1st Airborne, 1st Parachute Brigade, their plan stays exactly the same. Basically, for 1st Airborne, it's moving a few drop zones around from Nijmegen and Graaf to Arnhem. But the broad, they would have had the understanding of the broad plan. 82nd and 101st don't have that. 82nd obviously take over the drop zones and objectives around Nijmegen and Graaf. So there is an element of reusing, although I don't know to what extent there might have been a sharing of information, because the time scale is so short. That would be interesting. I didn't find any reference to that. One of the other key differences with Market Garden is the landings around Eindhoven are inserted. So for Comet, they weren't going to land around Eindhoven, so presumably they thought that the armoured advance wouldn't have any problems and they could just roll up to Graaf and Nijmegen without any capturing any bridges. By the time Market Garden happens, they're obviously nervous enough about German opposition that they identify these as an objective. And again, I didn't find anything about why or any rationale for that, but it does suggest that they're aware that it's not going to be a rollover, I think.
Is that maybe something to do with the fact that now the idea is that the front is solidifying, and that it is solidifying as close to the Allied front as Eindhoven?
Yeah, I think so, because I think from the Dutch-Belgian border to Nijmegen is a good 40 plus miles, which is quite a long way. And I think the idea of using 101st as laying a bit of a carpet. Obviously, they're capturing bridges, but I think very much their role is to almost create a staging post to help the armored advance. But it does suggest that a week after Comet was meant to happen, they're aware that this isn't going to be quite as simple, straightforward as we thought it might be.
So who are your naysayers to Market Garden? Because I know there's a lot of discussion about Monty and who he was as an individual. And he's, although a very capable commander, he's sometimes difficult to work with. So is there a lot of pushback to this?
He does make one hell of a cup, though.
So, I mean, Montgomery, I think, is fascinating in this because he's castigated for being cautious in Normandy, and then he's castigated for being reckless at Market Garden. And I think it's so interesting trying to square those.
What was it John said when we talked to him earlier this week, Bo, was if you're going to criticize Monty for being bold and daring, but you're going to praise George Patton for doing the same thing, you can't. And now you've got, it's Monty and Monty. He's too conservative. Yeah. Now he's too aggressive.
Yeah. And going back to Normandy, I think Wild Oats, that was ambitious. There was no lack of ambitious thinking. But in terms of naysayers, Montgomery's staff. So Montgomery's chief of staff, de Gongan, who was often effectively Montgomery's minder in a way, trying to calm him down and representing him and stopping him falling out with people. He was on sick leave around the time Market Garden was dreamt up. So you had a key person missing from the links. Dempsey is an interesting character, the Second Army, because he's very keen on Comet, but by the time Market Garden comes around, he seems to disappear from the history. So we see Horrocks appearing a lot at a core level, but Dempsey seems to disappear. The other key sort of naysayers, I would say, are probably Hackett, who commands 4th Parachute Brigade, who apparently, when briefing his staff for Arnhem, went through the actual briefing that he'd been given and then said to them afterwards, right, you can forget all that. Our biggest challenge isn't going to be defending Arnhem, it's going to be reaching it in the first place. And of course Sosabowski, who commanded the Poles, again a very experienced commander, very not shy about saying his piece. What about the Germans, as Gene Hackman would say. It seems obvious, doesn't it? What about the Germans? But you do find through these operations early on there were really good intelligence summaries and a consideration of the enemy situation. By the time you get to, Linnet is so, the estimation of the German situation is so vague. You do start to see almost the stereotypical old men and children on bicycles stuff starting to.
And that's just because of the retreat, the rapidity of the retreat, not being able to pin down where certain units are.
Yeah, and I guess the other problem you've got, by the time they get to Holland, there is a mistrust of the Dutch resistance because there's a fear that the Dutch resistance have been infiltrated. So in Belgium, there is quite good resistance information coming through. Holland, it's quite vague, to say the least.
Joe Hook about that, the possible infiltration of Dutch resistance, and it's hard, because think about it. This is in warfare, we typically think of the big picture stuff, stuff we see in movies, maybe stuff that is being portrayed in popular media. But man, this is a massive game of very bloody chess. And intelligence is a massive part of warfare and counterintelligence. So, how do you know what to trust? How do you know, what's legit and what's not? And that's, there is no formula to figure out what's tangible, useful intelligence and what isn't. So I understand, the want to be, err on the side of caution, but we're also in September 1944, and I think we may not be able to see the writing on the wall with the collapse of the Third Reich, but I think we are smelling hints.
Not a matter of when, or not a matter of if, but when.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think most German sources, apart from the completely fanatical Nazis, do say that, don't they? The enjoy the war because the peace will be terrible sort of stuff. I think even they acknowledge that.
So as they kind of start to wind into Market Garden, we've got a plan on paper. We know that British 1st Airborne is going to move towards Arnhem, 82nd is going to take Nijmegen, 101st Airborne could take Eindhoven, and 30 Corps will punch up the road right towards them and relieve them within 2 to 4 days. From what you saw from all of the shortcomings that were exposed in Linnet and Comet, what of those shortcomings and those errors came to fruition, even at the very onset of Market Garden?
I think there's a couple. I think distance from the objective. So if we look at Normandy, what characterized, say, Pegasus Bridge, for example, is that use of element of surprise, the ability to land airborne forces within reason wherever you want to. I think that some of the early operations in Normandy, you can see it almost drift over time. You can see it drift. And of course, at Arnhem, that's huge. I mean, one assessment I read once was that it's not so much a bridge too far as too far from the bridge, which I think is quite interesting, isn't it? Because the Germans, the Allies, react violently, so you have to make the most of that element of surprise because it's not going to take long for them to react, and 6 miles and 8 miles or whatever it is too far. I think that's a key one, and I think also the taking too long to get the forces in. So for some of these earlier operations, they were going to fly 2 flights a day, starting at first light and finishing at last light. Even Comet was going to have 2 lifts in one day. But Market Garden, that's scrapped because Brereton doesn't want to put too much strain on the transport crews. But if that was okay for the 10th of September, I can't see that there's a huge difference by the 17th of September because in Europe, I think we lose about 15 minutes of daylight per week. So 15 minutes doesn't feel like a huge, it doesn't feel critical to changing the plan that much. And so what you'd have had at Market Garden, for example, with Arnhem, if you'd had 4th Parachute Brigade landing on the evening of the 17th, that saves the Air Landing Brigade having to hold the drop zones for, more than you're getting on for 18 hours. So it frees up a huge amount of time. So when you get the, Al Murray's new book, Black Tuesday, about the fighting in the town and the woods on the 19th, that's given the Germans 2 days to get their resistance and to get their blocking lines in. If that happens a day earlier, again, going back to this, window of opportunity thing, it would have bought more time.
And that seems to be the common theme that we've found throughout everybody we've talked to and through all of our own independent reading and everything, is that Market Garden is full of windows of opportunity that just at the perfect second get slammed shut right in your face. And you're always an hour, a day, 6 miles, 8 miles away, or a minute from that window of opportunity going right in your favor. You think about Freddie Goff and the Jeep squadrons getting towards the bridge. Well, the fact that a couple of them get there, but that's forgotten, right? But that they get drawn in, and had they, had all the Jeeps arrived all at the same time, would they had the same amount of punch that was anticipated that they could have, right? Marty, when we were talking, is if the British paratroopers had prepared to stay in the town for 3 days as opposed to 2 days, would they have had an extra 100 rounds of Piat ammunition? It's the little things like that. 30 Corps, if they wouldn't have stopped on the first day after only having advanced for 4 hours as opposed to having advanced all day long, would that have been different? Would they have gotten to Eindhoven faster and seen the situation deteriorating there? If the 101st Airborne drops closer to the Zon Bridge, do the Germans have an opportunity to fire on it? All these things that add up to what becomes a bow. We can talk about whether or not it's a a failure or a success or a partial victory, or maybe it's a moral victory because God, you tried, right? But I think that's just a great way to kind of to get to Market Garden, is that we've stumbled through all these other operations. We've finally gotten to putting a plan on paper. It's in execution. Guys are in the air. The green light's given. They jump onto the ground. Armor starts moving up the road. And then we're 5-6 days in and everything is falling apart in just a week. We watched the entire operation cave in. And now, Bo, we can ask the question, James, do you think it's 75% effective, 80% effective, 90% successful, 20% for failure? What's the...
Can we rate it?
Can we rate it? And I don't know that there really is a good answer to this,
Do you know what? I think I probably change my mind every day, and I probably have done for about 30 years, depending on what you've read, depending on it. I think the way a sports scientist would call it fine margins, So
Mm-hmm.
a lot of these fine margins on their own probably aren't critical, but when you add them together,
Yeah.
I think that's probably the way I would see it. It's like on their own, some of these things going wrong could have been insurmountable. But when you add them all together, it's a cumulative effect. So I think that's why, slightly hedging my bets here, but I think certain aspects, very successful and very well done. And even in Used to Beak Perimeter, we see that whatever the tactical and the strategic mistakes might have been, there's no problem with the raw material of the men. They're very good fighters and really tough. But some of those fine margins that happen earlier in the battle are probably what hamstring it, I think.
I've come to the realization that Market Garden is a lot like a banana or an avocado. If you miss that ripe time, well, terrible.
Yeah.
I think that's got to be the one of the official slogans for the Market Garden 80 is Market Garden is an avocado.
Yeah.
God. All right. Avocados do what avocados do, and they go to shit in 24 hours.
It's literally like green. Here's the 30-second window. If you don't use me now, that's tough.
Yeah. Everything seems to come with an avocado nowadays.
Yeah, you're right. It's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Well, how about some boohickey?
Yeah. So when it comes to boohickey, man, like there's so much mythology of the Second World War. Like we were, talking with Paul Reed not long ago, talking about the mythos of the Second World War could essentially be its own podcast. You could write, probably a 7-volume work and only be 25% done. Then when it comes to Market Garden or even the lead up to it, what is something that you want people to know that in your opinion, people have misconstrued, or there's a fact of the matter that isn't so fact of the matter, something that you were to dispel?
Wow, that's huge. I suspect if I spent some time, there would be tons. Tea. I think Bridge Too Far.
Everybody goes for the tea.
Bridge Too Far introduced. Now, I'm not going to claim that British people don't drink tea. That would be really silly, because clearly we do. Although I don't. I've got blackcurrant juice. I'm a Brit that doesn't drink tea. Unfortunately, that scene probably overemphasized that a little bit. I think, and my previous job, I was assistant curator at the D-Day story in Portsmouth, and we did used to have lots of conversations with people who basically said British people just stopped to drink tea. And it did almost feel like they were parroting the film. And it's probably wrong to say it's a myth, but it's probably a cultural reference point that needs a little bit more understanding. So one of the great exhibits we put on display at the D-Day Music Story was a US Serviceman's Guide to Britain, and it's got this great line where it says, "You can't make a good cup of tea, the Brits can't make a good cup of coffee. It's an even swap." And I think that sums it up perfectly. Everyone likes a hot beverage, don't they?
And that's a great museum too. I just Bo, I think I told you I got to go over there when I finished up at We Have Ways. I went down to Portsmouth for a day, and it was, what can you jam into a day? Well, let's go see Suffolk House in the morning, go see HMS Victory, and then I had to go and see the D-Day Story Museum. I've got my little pin around here somewhere. I don't know. It's right over there. But oh well, here the tapestry. Yeah.
Oh, lovely. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was around. I just had to look for it. I've got a bunch of stuff on this desk. But James, this was really great, because what I think this has done is it helps us to frame ourselves up for the next week worth of episodes, where we've talked about what came, and now we've talked about the moment of execution. It is here at this point, to kind of paraphrase Eisenhower, all the Supreme Commander can do, all that Montgomery can do, all that Dempsey can do, and all that Browning can do is just hope that the plan works. And now, of course, over the next couple of days, we'll talk about all the various aspects of the plan and when it works and when it doesn't work. But now it is time for the kind of the wrap up segment here. So, Bo, what is in your cup?
So earlier, like I said, we were talking to Paul Reed, and I was working on a little bit of caffeine consumption, because historians inevitably work and for caffeine. That's how we get anything done. But in the most American fashion, I suppose, a little bit of Jack Daniels. It's been chilled. It's been a lovely thing to sip on, and I have to go teach in a few hours, so my lecture should be incredibly.
But you'll be fortified. You'll be fortified.
Absolutely.
James, how about yourself?
Yeah, I jumped the gun, didn't I? I've got some blackcurrant juice. Now, I for a long time, I used to drink far too much fizzy drink, so my favourites were Dr. Pepper and Iron Brew, which, if anyone doesn't know, is a Scottish beverage. Scotland's the only country in the world where Coca-Cola isn't the most popular soft drink. Iron Brew. So I'd suggest anyone try that out. But yeah, blackcurrant juice for me tonight.
Well, knowing that it was a British-themed episode for a Brit-centric operation, I had tea in my Monty cup. What's new? And shout out to our friends We Have Ways for the great old independent company mugs there. And two, this is the perfect opportunity now that we're at the end of the show to remind all of you, because everybody needs a reminder every now and again. You have to know that Homebrew History is, in fact, brought to you by Civil War Trails, the world's largest outdoor museum. Get out there, make some history of your own, travel the battlefields, travel the routes taken by armies, go to places where such incredible figures like Frederick Douglass grew up, find your way down from Maryland to Pennsylvania and then on to Virginia. And then you could even come and visit me in Tennessee, one of the largest participants in the Trails program, and jockey all around Middle Tennessee following the advance and retreat of General John Bell Hood and his Confederate Army of Tennessee, or go all the way down to Shiloh along that trail from, say, Summertown on down towards Savannah, and you can follow right along with the Army. So get out there, make some history of your own, snap a selfie with your sign, use the hashtag #SignSelfie, and tag Civil War Trails on social media. Let them know that Homebrew History sent you. But there is our little promo there. That's Bo. I think I should be paid by the second for those, because I spend some original yarns here.
It would be half the episode if that were true.
I'd keep going.
I know you would.
Trails. You'll never see more dedicated.
I tell you what, James, it's funny you brought up the Scottish beverage. Joey and I have a mutual colleague, Dr. Mark Dries. He goes to Peru about every other summer to do a study abroad trip over there. And before the early 1990s, if I'm not mistaken, they also used to produce their own sort of national beverage called Inca Cola. And it was one of the very few beverages in the world where a nation produced it, and it wasn't, a Coca-Cola beverage. But unfortunately, in the early 1990s, Coca-Cola bought Inca Cola. So they kept the original recipe, but now there's an Inca Cola Zero. But that's unique. I'm kind of curious to know more about that. And
I think if Iron Brew ever got bought out, there'd be some sort of national rebellion. It's a cult. It's got a cult status in Scotland.
There's a gas station over here in the States called Buc-ee's, and that's probably the closest thing to a cult following in that aspect. like if something were to happen to them, there would be national riots.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I think so. But we can always remember that the finest of all of the, homemade, place-made sodas, Ward's root beer. You can't beat that. Anyhow, now that I've outed myself as a Ward's man, I think this is a perfect time for me to make a quick escape off of the show. James, this has been fantastic. The book is out now, right? And you can get it through Frontline Books. Yep.
Yeah, Frontline Books, Pen and Sword, who are the own the Frontline imprint, and plenty of other places wherever you get your books from.
Awesome. James, great to have you. Bo, always a pleasure. And I'll see you real soon.
Yeah.
We've got another one of these this evening.
That's right.
Okay.